Hello, everybody out there in the Frisbee world. You might be practicing by yourself. You might be lucky enough to be in a situation where you can throw with people again. That would be great. I've got a video review, technique review from my buddy out in Italy, Alberto, who has a forehand and a backhand for me to review. So I'm going to be giving him some advice based on what I can see with his technique and form. And hopefully that advice is useful for you guys to watch as well, everybody else who's watching these videos. And there's usually going to be some crossover between maybe what he could do to improve and what you can do to improve. So let's hop right in and have a look at Alberto's forehand. So we're going to play the video. He's got a couple angles here for me. They're both from the side. There's a forehand throw. And here's another one. Now, I'd like to have seen a view from the front, a view from the back, just so I can see the flight of the disc, and also a view from the other side, just so I get a better angle of what's happening. But right away, let's look at what Alberto's doing here. This is more of like a Huck, where he's able to take a step out from a pivot foot, and same with this one. So there's no run up involved here. There's no approach. You can get a little more speed or a little more power if you actually, if this is meant for maximum distance and you don't have to establish a pivot. If you're going to pull the disc on your forehand, you can actually run into the throw and create a bit of an X step. And I'll show you what that looks like with myself. So here I'm starting, I've got the disc high. I actually hop into that final couple of steps here. So there's a little X step, and my footwork is contributing to the torque of that throw. So there's a hop, and then I throw. So that's just one thing to address right away, is that if you want to get a little more distance, you could actually do that by utilizing some footwork and getting an X step, crossover step. But if this isn't a pull and this is more of a Huck situation, then we can also still do a couple things to optimize. The one big thing here that I'm seeing right away is the finished position of your follow through. So you can see that with Alberto here, he's actually turning his wrist over as if he was throwing like a football or a ball or something. That's a really nice, natural finished position for having thrown a ball. And that's something that we ingrain into our body mechanics, probably subconsciously, through our entire adolescence, throwing other objects. But then when it comes to throwing a frisbee, you don't actually want on your forehand to turn your wrist over like that, because that's going to reduce the inside out flight pattern of the frisbee, which is where you're going to get a lot more of that distance. And you'll find that the disc is actually turning over in the air because your wrist is finishing and causing that disc to want to turn over more. So what you want to actually do is finish with your wrist pointing externally rotated. And I'll show you, you can just barely see that on my throw. The finish of my throw here, you just see my wrist peek out. So here I've got my wrist pointed at the sky, and you'll see I'm doing everything within my power to keep my wrist from turning over. And here you can actually see my hand. My lower hand there is in fact still pointing up at the sun. I've got lots of sunlight bouncing off the inside of my wrist. So you want to keep your thumb from turning over and pointing too much at the ground with that internal rotation of the wrist, which is kind of what we've got with Alberto here. So Alberto, you could improve the overall flight of your frisbee by maintaining that IO shape. You're doing a really good job of actually having the lower edge dropped. So when he's stepping into this throw, the point of release, he's actually got that outside edge dropped and pointed toward the ground. That's great. Now we can exaggerate that benefit by also not letting that wrist turn over the way it is here, right? Another thing I'm seeing with the forehand is the tilt of the shoulders could actually, again, be a bit more exaggerated in order to get more of that IO shape. And when I say IO, I mean inside out flight pattern. It crosses sort of your body's angle there, your plane, comes across, and then it drifts back to the right. So if you're a right-handed thrower, the disc is going to finish its flight from left to right. And I imagine with these throws of Alberto's here, these discs, I can't see how they're finishing their flights, but I would imagine that based on what his wrist and hand are kind of doing here, I imagine these discs end up flying from right to left. So Alberto, if you're watching this, you want to make sure that the end of your flight is still, as much as possible, the disc is finishing its flight, drifting from left to right. And you're going to get more power that way because distance that way because you can actually add more power to a disc that continues to maintain that IO shape than a disc that is overpowered, doesn't have enough spin, and ends up turning over in the air. So to get more of that shape, you can tilt your shoulders during your throw. And I'll give an example of what that looks like on my throw here. So I've got my nice high start, and I'm snapping at the bottom. You can see the outside edge of the disc has a nice angle down toward the ground, and my shoulders have quite a lot of tilt to them too, and that helps everything stay in line and be powerful through that shape. And you can see the disc is coming out on that trajectory that's going to help it drift from left to right. Now, Alberto, your shoulders there's a good drop here, and then they sort of square out. So if you can try to keep that right shoulder a little lower by, instead of leaning back in your release, maybe lean out to the side a little more. So otherwise, I'm seeing some good hand speed through those throws, and everything is looking good. I think it's just a matter of getting the wrist to stay open instead of turning over and closing, and getting some shoulder tilt. I'd love to see your throws after you implement those. Now let's hop over to your backhand and see what we've got going on there. A couple of backhand throws here. Oh, we've just got the one. Okay, so with this backhand throw, the first thing that stands out to me is how much your spine is moving. So in relation to your body, your spine is actually kind of doing a bit of this. It's kind of like if it was to trace a shape in air, it's kind of creating a cone of three-dimensional, what would you even call that? It's tracing out like a cone shape. And you want your spine to stay fixed in space as much as possible and rotate around a fixed axis, just because that's going to be a more efficient rotation. And it's also going to be able to tolerate more speed and whip. If you're relying on your whole body to generate that speed, it's just impossible to create what you're doing here as fast as someone can just spin around their spine. So you're taking this nice powerful step. That's great. But here your head is kind of moving a lot through space, and your chest is finishing pointing down at the ground. And it could be increased in efficiency. We're going to hop over to a video of what I mean by finishing with a higher chest here, where if you're rotating around your spine, your chest actually finishes kind of pointing up and more at your target. So this is kind of me like exaggerating that rotation around the spine, and also you'll see the tilt of my shoulders is allowing for, on a backhand, an IO release shape, which is going to result in a disc that finishes its flight drifting from right to left. So that's the opposite of what the IO would be for the forehand. And on your throw, let's see what we've got here. Snap. It does look as though the outside edge of that disc is pointed to the ground subtly, but you can get a little more of that by having those shoulders more in line with each other and your step and the spine. And instead of, again, going forward with your throw, you're stepping out to the side as if you're stepping around somebody and throwing with your chest a little higher on that finish instead of pointed at the ground. So instead of kind of stepping forward and hunching forward, you want to step out to the side and finish high. And then on a pull, it's going to allow you to really rotate around that throw with a lot of speed, around your spine with a lot of speed. And if it is pulling, in fact, you can even lift your foot up off the ground and allow yourself to spin. So here, that back foot, you're trying to keep it planted, and if that's a Huck situation, then you need to establish that pivot foot. But if you're just going for max distance, you can actually lift that back foot off the ground, let your hips spin around, because you can really see how that back foot, because you're forcing it to stay planted, it's actually arresting your rotation right here. So you could be getting more rotation by letting that part follow through and lifting the back foot and letting it rotate with the rest of your body. So right there is where I'm talking about lifting that back foot. So here you can see that if I didn't lift that back foot on this pull, I would be stopping my hips rotation there, but because my back foot is off the ground, I can actually continue to turn and rotate, and it actually ends up in front of my throwing foot. The last thing I'll say for this throw, Alberto, is on your backhand, it looks as though you could accommodate a little bit more wrist cock. So here your wrist isn't fully brought, it's not quite all the way back here. There is still some space between, let's see if I can lock that frame. Right there, it does look as though there's still some space between your disc and your wrist. So right about there's still a little bit of space. That extra space is taking away from your spin. So if you have any space between your wrist and the disc on your backhand, close that up and start your throw with the disc already touching your wrist. Make sure everything's in line. So you don't want it to be like that in relation to your arm. You want it to be lined up with your forearm and to have everything in contact right from the start. That's going to ensure maximum spin, and I'll show you what that looks like. In windup on my pull here, you'll see that when I'm back, I've already got that wrist and disc assembly all locked up and in contact, and it just stays there until I actually release the throw. Bam, there it goes. So I hope that was helpful from a technical standpoint, and that you can implement some of those tips in your throws, your forehands, your backhands. Everyone else watching, I'll leave a link in the video description here if you want to get your video footage reviewed. Just make sure that you click that link below, and make sure that you include multiple angles. So an angle from behind, an angle from the front, and an angle from left and from the right. From the back view, I'd like to actually see the disc in flight and how the disc finishes its flight. That actually tells me a lot about the amount of spin that's on the disc and the characteristics of the power versus spin. So that's all. If you want to get some reviews, check that out below. Otherwise, guys, remember to subscribe and hit the thumbs up if this was helpful. If you have any comments or questions about your throws, stick them in the field below, and I'll do my best to get to all of those. Thanks.